And so today I want us to continue with that theme. Um, we are going to begin with this image, so there's an audio clip going around, very interesting, that where the president asks why um, the personification of the United States is Colombia. This is Colombia. Yeah, and other weird clips of whether we should call DC District of America. Um, which also reminds me that America was derived from Amerigo Vespucci, who was Italian. So, I don't anyway, Columbia. Some people say it's the personification of Columbus, is the female version of Columbus, but she is the representation of the United States. Now, there are some things to interpret in this personification. Uh, so, and of course, some history as to how she came to be the personification of the United States, including, for example, the War of 1812, the of enslaved poet Phyllis Wheatley writes a poem about Columbia. But anyway, what's important is that Columbia is the personification of the United States. And there's a lot to interpret in that image. So, for example, you can see Native Americans to the right. You can see wagons, sort of, if you think about how the United States was settled, wagons going west. You can see buffalo sort of going off into the left. There's a train behind Columbia, and at her feet is a stagecoach. So that was one of the most significant ways of travel in the United States. There's ships in the far right of the image. And then down here you can see farmers, homesteaders, settlers, people who were cultivating. Now, Columbia holds a book and telegraph lines. And so this, what is generally thought of as this image, which is actually titled American Progress, is that Columbia leads Americans into the West, into the future, and so sort of like pushing old traditions and Native Americans and those kinds of things into the darkness. Sort of like bringing light to the continent in a new way. Now, what I often suggest we think about is okay, it's wonderful that Colombia is doing these things, but what is she doing to Native Americans? What did the United States do to Native Americans? And so we see quite a bit of conflict, so Indian wars. So, for example, the Great Sioux War, Lakotas against the United States. And a lot of former American presidents were actually involved in this war. So, for example, William Harrison, Andrew Jackson, and there's quite a bit of literature about how Native Americans should move west. As we mentioned, there were these prophets and visionaries and inspired people who thought that they were called to fight this encroachment by Europeans. So, for example, the ghost dance movement, the idea that indigenous people would rise from graves. And if you remember, Tuesday we talked about Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, particularly Tenskwatawa, had the same kind of message that people will rise from graves and defeat the invaders. But again, I want you to see this other, so people are encroaching onto Native American land and taking it by force or by deception or other things. And so, for example, Native Americans have very interesting names. So, for example, they had a chief called Sitting Bull who was killed by the police. And you actually see a lot of these deceptions and murders and those kinds of things, not just with Native Americans, but everywhere Europeans are expanding. Most people will be familiar with Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 in, I think, North Dakota today. This actually became a site of Indian resistance in 1973. So again, sort of think about the wonderful expansion of the United States, but also who gets kicked out of their land. And so this is expansion by conquest, and it's not just the United States, so we shall also include other places that begin to conquer territory, including Germany, France, so like colonies, the US, Russia. Russia spreads east. In Japan, spreads to the west, so it takes northern China, Manchuria, which it creates a country called Manchukuo. People like the British are taking colonies, for example, in India, and later on they are going to take colonies in Africa and Eastern Asia. And so, as we mentioned, for the most part, colonial subjects were not members of the nation, which is ironic because you found them there and suddenly they are not citizens, which again sort of brings to light the question of the 14th Amendment. How do you define citizenship? What is citizenship? Recent executive orders suggest that if you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, then your kids can't be American citizens. And I'm like, wait, what does subject to the jurisdiction of the United States mean? Am I obligated to obey US law if, for example, I am here on a visa? And then if I am not, can I maybe have two wives, like they do over there in Kenya? So there are these questions of jurisdiction and being subject to citizenship and those kinds of things. Actually, I've sometimes argued, and I don't know if you remember the Mr. Trump talking about Obama and how he was born in Kenya. And so that made him a Kenyan citizen, even though he was born in 1961 when Kenya was a British colony, so therefore he would be a British subject. But was he a British citizen? Interesting things to think about. But anyway, so as these empires are expanding, we see an increase in sort of trying to understand native peoples, but also sometimes murdering them. We saw how Australian Aborigines were treated, put in chains and those kinds of things. But also colonial schools were teaching indigenous peoples the colonizers' languages, which is why, for example, if you think about the languages spoken in a continent like Africa, or for example, the idea that most Vietnamese do speak French. You're like, wait, France is over there. How are Vietnamese? So this is the colonial legacy of languages and cultures and so on. And so, as we mentioned, the new world nations have tried to create loyalty to political institutions and so on. The expansion through treaties, military warfare, conquest, but also deception. And again, manifest destiny, the idea that God intended the United States to extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so what happens to the people who are there? Loss of land, but also creation of reservations, which I think is, well, I will not express my public opinions on that. So We talked about William Harrison being responsible for part of the removal of Indians, the defeat of Tenskwatawa in the Shawnee. Now, Andrew Jackson was a US president, I think maybe 1830, 1829 to sometime. But if you have heard of the Trail of Tears, he was the person who was responsible for that. Um, so other things, for example, the moving the Cherokees west by the U.S. government, and about 4,000 of them dying. So this becomes the Trail of Tears. So Andrew Jackson responsible for that. And so again, we see resistance to this Western encroachment, but there isn't really a way to defeat the superior arms and superior armies. And so I included some text here of the communications by Andrew Jackson. And you can sort of see how the US represents itself. So it gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the United States government in the relation to the removal of Indians beyond white settlements, removal of Indians. So removal of Indians, an act of violence, but to prove in the end an act of enlarged philanthropy. So the theory that the US government is doing a good thing and helping Indians to move west. But one of the other strategies was so as the westward expansion is happening, think about what is happening to Native Americans' livelihoods. So, for example, we saw the Shawnee resorted to farming because buffalo had been almost exterminated. If you remove people's source of food, you kind of control them. And so by about 1884, you can see how many buffalo, bison remained. Now, of course, they have been, we have tried to repopulate them. But again, sort of think about how Native Americans eventually are moved into reservations. And as I mentioned, they kind of became US citizens in 1924, which is kind of ironic that they become citizens 200 and maybe 150 years later. My math is not. So this is not, the expansion and the destruction is not just in the United States. Again, think about places like Canada. Of course, they had their own native populations, and so what happens to those populations? So, for example, if you know the history of Canada, so these are the provinces. Nunavut, that's where you have particularly Eskimos, but they populated the whole of Canada, and the British are taking over. They're signing these treaties, but then violating them. Interestingly, Quebec remained sort of under French influence. In fact, the official language of the province of Quebec is French. And people in Quebec see themselves as maybe not Canadians, like they would have their own country. There was a referendum, and I think it failed by maybe 1 percentage point. So Canadians also moved Native Americans north and south. Expansionism. Now, Canada is actually a little interesting because, and again, it's amazing how history repeats itself. Recently, there has been a lot of rhetoric about how Canada should be the 51st state. And this is something that Canada has always feared. And if you are familiar with much of what goes on in Canada, Canada is actually sort of like a British dominion. The head of state of Canada is King Charles, the British king. They do have a prime minister Justin Trudeau just stepped down. I think now Mark Carney is the new prime minister. But you can sort of see even though Canada became independence in 1867, there was a fear that the United States the might absorb Canada, which is again the discussions that I'm not sure that Canada will become the 51st state, but you can sort of see those discussions. Now, let's pivot for a moment to Latin America and see what was going on there. How are nations expanding and creating new nations, new loyalties, new expansions? We already saw some of what maybe Mexico was going on. Um, wait, why did I have this slide here? Yeah, going to skip that and talk about Latin America. So, Latin America territorial expansion. Remember, most of Latin America becomes independent from about 1821 to about 1840. And so it begins expanding territory. So the new state, and again, this was kind of like the US. If you think about who belonged to the state or what the population's status was, Mexico or many Latin American countries leave out indigenous peoples, they leave out enslaved people. So thinking about who was a citizen, it was a very small group. And so the idea of national identities was very constrained. Now, Latin America sometimes got into civil wars. So between the different ethnic groups. So, for example, in Colombia, you see an uprising by Black people because they are not represented. Their circumstances are really challenging. But also, you begin to see some of the richest, most productive lands converted into estates. And so these estate owners are the ones who kind of belong or define what the state is. But at the same time, there were fears of uprisings by indigenous people, as I mentioned. And so the governments would keep an eye to make sure that the large populations that are excluded do not become problematic. And so if you actually look at countries like Brazil, the nation state excluded, so there were very few people who owned territory and land and those kinds of things. Now, Brazil experienced slave resistance, and even when slavery was abolished in 1888, so when slave trade was abolished in 1807, 1808, Brazil still kind of engaged in purchasing enslaved people. So, for example, between 1850 and 1880, Brazil imported 300,000 Africans. Now, of course, this is bootlegging, like it's piracy of slavery. But the idea, so especially this period of time, Brazil had discovered coffee, and coffee grew very well. So you had enslaved people working with free people. And so eventually it was like, well, maybe we should just pay people to work. And so it imports, together with the slaves or enslaved people, it imports other people, for example, indentured laborers. This was not just Brazil's strategy. We actually see a lot of indentured people imported. For example, the United States imported lots of Chinese people to build the railways. And there was a whole thing about, whether they could be carried on British ships and those kinds of things. But, again, importation, we look at this as maybe now semi-voluntary migration. But again, even the people who have been imported were not really integrated into the state. But we actually see Brazil extending its territories to the south, especially the Amazon River Basin. Brazil had a president recently, Jair Bolsonaro, who called himself the Brazilian Trump. And part of his strategy was to sort of like allow logging near the Amazon or in the Amazon basin where we have these native populations. Now, of course, you're taking away their lands, but the argument is the same. We are bringing modernity to these people who are backward, maybe. But yeah, the state gives or gave capitalists the concessions to plant rubber, to extract rubber, but also to cut trees for sale. And so again, you sort of see this exclusive class build up. So for example, it mirrored what was in the US um, before maybe 1865, well, actually before 1830. Because then the US was very exclusive, property owning white males. Brazil had kind of that thing. Now, eventually, the rubber boom stopped, and because actually rubber was now being grown in Indonesia, and so you can sort of see the global commerce and how it's affecting different places and different people. So Brazil was left maybe just producing coffee. Um, Today, Brazilian coffee is still quite a thing. But so Brazil expands, creates economic activity, and so the other Latin American countries are beginning to consolidate. So, for example, if you think of Bolivia or Colombia, they are consolidating, but also excluding maybe external populations. I'm going to call them that. Indigenous populations, African populations. And so, for example, at some point, the African population in Colombia was 40%, but they were excluded from the franchise. So, again, the idea of dividing society based on color, birth, or social status determined who was going to be a member of the state. But let's go back to Europe and sort of see how Europeans consolidate city-states. So think about, for example, Italy, Germany. France was trying to expand, but especially Italy and Germany are now trying to actually consolidate the state. And so for Europe, there was really nowhere to expand because, unless you invade other people, how are you going to expand? And if you invade other people, they are then going to come back and fight you for the stuff that you've taken from them. But there are questions of who, like the definition of who is a member of the state. What is the nation? And so when you sort of think about the nation, meaning kings, clergymen, nobles, rich merchants, and as we saw, for example, in Britain, when the working class tried to become involved in the political process, the parliament shut them down. Again, think about all of these countries, and in none of them do women vote. So already you have excluded half the population, not because they of any specifically defensible reason. It's just because, well, who decides who are the people? Who decides what the nation state is? But also, what is the nation state? And so these are some of the challenges that Europeans will face. And so, for example, thinking about who the people are, some places would be people who spoke the same language. But again, if you look at, so maybe most people in France speak French, but look at other nation states like Belgium. Belgium has three major linguistic groups. Switzerland, three major linguistic groups: German language, French, and is it French? Three language groups. But the idea is what defines the people? What is the nation? And so, for example, you see multi-ethnic nations in the Balkans. And so if you actually decided that everybody who shares a language, history, culture are members of one nation, in Africa you'd have 2,600 different nations, which is, I think, a lot. Um, but so even countries with the same language, so for example, Ireland and England, were different because Ireland, for example, was Catholic and uh, England was more Protestant. And so there was really no agreement as to who people were. And I include this map of United Kingdom and Ireland. So the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland includes Wales, Northern Ireland. Now, Ireland, there's an Irish language, but they also speak English. And so what distinguishes them from the British? There is a Welsh language, but Wales is part of the United Kingdom. In fact, the heir to the British throne is usually referred to as the Prince of Wales. So, building nation states was, I think, quite a bit complicated. Now, in other places, for example, Germany attempts to unify. And when you sort of think about German speakers, they kind of lived everywhere. They lived in Czechoslovakia, they lived in, now, those were not countries at that time. But they lived in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and other regions, including parts of France. And so sort of think about how the German state comes to be. The Holy Roman Empire becomes the German nation, but then there's also Prussia. So from about 1871 to 1946, Germany was called Germany and the Kingdom of Prussia. So like they were combined. But so we actually begin to see the consolidation of new nations. For example, Otto von Bismarck was instrumental in unifying the German state. Camillo de Cavour creates the Italian nation. And so again, think about how European nations are consolidating partly through war. Now, we have probably mentioned Napoleon's cousin, Louis Napoleon III, who became president of France, and then he tried to expand France and invaded Germany, but then Germany kind of defeated him. So now in terms of thinking about, for example, let's look at Italy and how it consolidates. And so if you look at a map of Italy, you see quite a number of kingdoms. So for example, kingdoms of Sardinia, Modena, Florence, Papal States, Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Venetia. So very fractured. And so eventually you're going to see the unification of the Italian state by consolidating all of these different nations. And so by about 1862, Italy has the shape that it has today. And so as we mentioned, Camillo de Cavour is considered the Italian unifier together with Giuseppe Garibaldi. And so actually you see, like at some point only the Papal State remained outside of Italy. So but eventually the Vatican is going to be subsumed into Italy. And so by 1870 you're going to see Italy completely unified as one country. So that is the current map of Italy. And so some of European states become by consolidating and taking the fractured states. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck, Prussian, and a member of the aristocratic Junker class, and so his nickname was Iron Chancellor because he kind of really forges the German nation by force and by diplomacy. He achieves German unification in 1871. Interestingly, the German nation was proclaimed in France. sort of like the same way the United States became a country through the Paris agreements. So interesting ways to think about. And so here is, yeah, here is the sort of German states, principalities. And so you can see on the right, well, probably can't read all of those, but there were sort of different principalities. Of great importance is this province here. So when France decided to invade Germany and was defeated, um, Germany actually fought back and took over that province called Alsace-Lorraine. Contained lots of iron ore and other natural resources. Iron ore is used to make steel. And so France loses quite a bit of industrial output. And so again, sort of think about how consolidation of Germany is going to affect European politics. Now, the Alsace-Lorraine will cause colonization of Africa. Because Germany, instead of fighting with France over Alsace-Lorraine, Germany says, well, you could maybe go over there in Africa and, take some territory. But so this is the map of the principalities and states and electorates that eventually join with Prussia to become the Germany and the Kingdom of Prussia. So eventually this becomes the German nation. Now, today it's smaller. So, for example, places like Königsberg were lost. I think Königsberg is now occupied by Russia or Poland, Gdansk. Now, Alsace-Lorraine will eventually go back to the Germans after the First World War, which ends in 1919. And France will also begin to occupy parts of Germany, which again is sort of like you're really planning for another war because people will fight over their stuff. And so when we sort of think about unification, you see these two maps, what Germany kind of eventually looked like, and what Italy looks like by 1870. Now, when these nations consolidate, the question is, what do they become? Are they democratic states? Are they republican constitutions? What kind of state are they? Now, so you will probably know that Italy had a king until 1945, maybe, after the Second World War. Germany also had an emperor who was generally referred to as the Kaiser. So Kaiser Wilhelm II was actually the last German sort of emperor. And so a lot of, you see the rise of monarchical power, so monarchies, kingdoms, and so on. But so even as they consolidate, there is a lot of internal divisions. But also, for example, Germany unifies at the expense of Habsburg. So Austrian Habsburgs were the major force, but eventually they kind of are minimized to include Austria and Hungary in the Balkans. Now, creating such an empire also creates problems, and we are going to see these problems among discontented subjects. So, for example, the Serbs, the Croats, and so on. And so, particularly Serbia, right next to Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, like you have a new kingdom imposed on you. And so, like we saw with the rebellions in the American West, we're also going to see these rebellions, especially in the Balkans. So at some point, we'll talk about the First World War. We shall mention Gavrilo Princip, who was a member of a group that was called the Black Hand. And so they decided to assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. And the reason they assassinate him is they think that if you assassinate him, then you can gain independence, but that actually didn't happen. In fact, what that did was trigger the First World War. But the First World War was going maybe to happen, at least that's what most people think. And so Austria-Hungary is plagued by nationality problems. And I think there's a map here that shows you some of those ethnicities. So this is the Austria-Hungary Empire. Now, so in about 1877, Serbia kind of becomes half independent. But again, to the left, you can see Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is where the Black Hand was mostly operating from. In terms of the ethnicities, you see, for example, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Serbs, Croats, Poles, and other nationalities. And so if you are in one empire, all of you, you're like, well, why can't we maybe be independent? And so this will cause, just because they're consolidating doesn't mean that they are necessarily united. So for example, this shows you where, well, especially the north, you can see where some of the Austrians and Germans lived. And so this becomes a catalyst for some of the conflicts that we're going to see. Lots of discontent by